Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today. My name is Erin Nevius. I'm ACRL's content strategist, and this is ACRL Presents Cultures of Collecting, Sustaining Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Collection Development. As Elois mentioned, today's session is being recorded, and we'll post the recording on ACRL's YouTube channel and link to it from our website. Please make sure your chat box is set to go to all presenters and attendees and add any questions you have throughout the presentation. Mary Beth Locke, Associate Dean of the Z. Smith Reynolds Library and Chair of the ACRL EDI Committee, will moderate that discussion. I'd like to thank today's presenters, Tamar Evangelestia-Dougherty, Associate University Librarian at Cornell University Library, with responsibility for rare and distinctive collections, Roxanne Backowski, Assistant Professor and the Head of Electronic Resources and Acquisitions at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and Scarlett Galvin, Area Lead for Assessment and Planning and Collection Strategist Librarian at Grand Valley State University Libraries. This webcast and ACRL's other free professional development opportunities are made possible in part by your ACRL membership, which helps fund many of our programs and services for the academic and research library community. Not a member? Join nearly 10,000 of your colleagues and become a member today. Visit ala.org/ACRL/membership for more information. Mary Beth, please feel free to start when you're ready.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Erin. I appreciate it. The ACRL EDI Committee is very excited to have these three presenters give us some insights into how it is that we can diversify collections. I'm very excited also to be able to learn from them as well. As Erin mentioned, at the end of the three presentations, then we will have some opportunity for Q&A. So please put your questions into the chat box as you have them, and then I'll sort of gather them together and answer or try to be able to present those that seem to be compelling enough to to mention here, because I'm sure that there will be lots of questions and we'll get to as many as we can. I appreciate ACRL allowing us to create this presentation for all of you. Obviously, there's a great deal of interest in this this subject, and we're all very excited to be able to have you here. So thank you, and you can take it away, Tamar.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. Thank you everyone for having me this afternoon. The title of my presentation is Drawing Inclusive Collections from Exclusive Narratives. And I actually want to go back a second, looking at the shirt here, which I think really tickled me when I saw it, because it just shows when you flip the narrative on something, what it exactly looks like and how it affects people of color. So I thought that was a really appropriate image. These words all coming together are everything that I felt in the past year, 2020. Collections are what bring researchers into our physical and digital spaces, and the reason one library is unique from another. What would our libraries be without our collections and the stories they tell? As curators and librarians, we use our privilege and authority to create spaces for meaning making through our collections. And before the storm that was 2020, I suspect that many of us made assumptions about what our users wanted when we attended rare book fairs, or we blissfully followed our approval plans. But that was then, and this is now. This week marked the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. It seems so far away to me now, but while we as librarians made sense of it all, the inability to access our physical collections, all while embracing, albeit somewhat awkwardly, our civic and social roles as they related to diversity, inclusion, and belonging within the framework of collection development, was a mammoth task. No one will ever forget that this perfect storm converged under a climate of social and political tensions and cultural contestation. Engagement of our users shifted from how do we get our patrons access to our collections to how do we get patrons access and prove that we are in solidarity with anti-racist principles through our collections and services. Many libraries, as you know, quickly pivoted to more inclusive and equitable approaches to collecting in post-colonial context, and improving our civic engagement and greater understanding of the human experience for all. But really, everyone, as there seems to be an end in sight now, how did we really do when it came to diversifying our collections? What grade would you give LIS over the last year? Did we really interrogate our own curatorial authority and ongoing cultural bias as we attempted to embed DEI practices within our collection development plans? In that huge lift, which was 2020, did we really find the best way to build collections around alternative narratives? My presentation will discuss how the 2020 crisis and through the DEI kitchen sink at us as librarians and all the missteps which will potentially come with it, I believe will strengthen the relationships between libraries and the diverse communities we serve. And I wanted to also have us think, just reflectively, what progress has been made around DEI in libraries since 2020. I know from many of the initiatives we took at Cornell, first there was awareness. We saw a lot of public statements from libraries, museums, and archives speaking out against racism. And I think librarians seem to be aware that we needed to develop those soft skills and that emotional intelligence competencies around such initiatives. Inclusion, there were a lot of supportive library administrators who have added more DEI related librarian positions at all levels, such as AULs for diversity and inclusion. Acquisitions, many libraries embarked upon some pretty aggressive acquisitions strategies and enhanced access to collections that were related to cultural heritage and under-engaged narratives. And you may notice that throughout my presentation, I do not normally like to use the word underrepresented. I think when you say underrepresented, it kind of means that the voices were not represented in the collection, but I believe they were. We just underengaged them. So that's a term that I've been incorporating into my arsenal of the way I speak about these issues. Services, building culturally ethical services, which are more people-centered. We moved towards anti-racist services for patrons that were embedded in our library as a service point. And also for engagement, we established straightforward visions to guide equitable principles around empowerment, which built trust between the libraries and cultural partners. So as you assess the past year, it would be nice to use this framework and see how you felt that your institution measured up, as well as the efforts that you put into this. And I wanted to say all the images in my presentation are from the Cornell Rare and Distinctive Collections. And this is an image from our hip hop collection from our Division of Rare Manuscript collections. I call this killing exclusion softly. And the reason why I don't say killing exclusion, hardly, because in some ways there's a lot of common missteps that we make when diversifying collections, and it's only chipping away at part of the problem. I really believe that when we reflect about the cultural differences and equity in our collections, and when it comes to curatorial acquisitions, every library has a cultural construction of what diversity and equity means for them, with underlying ideas and assumptions and power structures that go along with that within their library. And I've worked at a lot of libraries, and many of them have different power structures and ways of approaching diversity. These power structures and assumptions made around collection development and this dynamic is what you have to interrogate when undertaking DEI work within the framework of collection development. We saw a lot of libraries come out and say that they would begin collecting more BIPOC material or digitizing more, but I really believe if you simply are acquiring or implementing increased digitization efforts for your cultural heritage collection with the belief that your collection is suddenly now anti-racist or decolonized, you're wrong, and you're only killing systemic racism softly. And Cornell is no stranger to the initiatives that everyone took this year. We did acquire new collections, and our curators did decide to use 100% of our appropriated budget for collections of color. And these are just some of the things we purchased. One is an Ethiopian prayer book that was purchased by Laurent Ferry, our curator of pre-1800 collections. These two images, one is a Jacob Lawrence painting that we purchased from Swan Galleries by Eric Acree, our curator of Africana collections and director of the John Henrik Clark Africana Library. This bottom poster, which is a very vintage movie poster, was a joint acquisition between our Africana division and our Caucasia division. When you look at, this is kind of a joke slide for me. When you look at research methodologies for exclusive but well-meaning DEI collection development, if we kind of follow this path, you know, the idea is to decolonize your collection and the methods. And if, again, if the methods are acquiring lots of POC collections, digitizing lots of POC collections, you could still end up with cultural appropriation and othering and isolating, because just because you acquisitions to me has never meant the end of curation or the end of stewardship. And so where do you find yourself? You find yourself back at needing to decolonize your collections. When you approach this work thoughtfully, the idea is to go beyond diversity and inclusion, and really belonging is the key piece for that you want to get out 100%. You have to ask yourself questions such as, why are you collecting? Who are you collecting for? And really go beyond that diversity towards inclusion and belonging. Common missteps in diversifying library collections and services. A term that I've been using quite often is curatorial blackface. You have to resist the temptation to call in for black up. You have to be authentically inclusive of your colleagues of color and ask if they can identify and share any precedent and DEI collection development efforts that you can build upon them. And I use, as an example, recently I was talking to a colleague who was somewhat upset, and it was not here at Cornell, but another institution, where once, you know, the George Floyd, you know, the wave hit and librarians began collecting in BIPOC collections, they never bothered to ask this librarian if they had done some of this work before. So always be mindful of that. Another misstep is helicopter outreach. When you sort of just hover or float over the communities without really authentically engaging them on a consistent basis. I think a good example of that is I noticed that some predominantly white institutions will always reach out to Black communities during Black History Month. And then once that's over, you don't see any more engagement with them. And while it may be once a year, it's still just kind of hovering above and not really becoming embedded in that community so that you can do collection work together. The next is cultural ghosting. It's a little bit like helicopter outreach, but the difference is you really only engage with the community when you need something. And I think a good example of that is probably some grant projects. You really need to do this grant work. So you need to show to the funder that, you know, you're embedded with this community. And then once the project is over, you kind of just goes to community, particularly if it's projects around processing collections. They still have work to do if they're community archives once you process those collections. And so it's really nice not to ghost them when that's happening. Some examples of curatorial blackface, because I often get that question a lot. I'm going to give some examples of quotes that other librarians have shared with me. I was only asked to join curators on donor calls when the donor of interest was of color. We think the donor would relate better to you. That's actually what the fellow curators said to that person who was a Black archivist. Or I was told that I'm the face or the spokesperson of the POC collection, but I have no authentic agency or authority for its stewardship and engagement. As a Black faculty member, I'm rarely invited to teach in the archives except when a Black collection is involved. And my research interest isn't even African American history. And I just wanted you to know that the first sentence actually came from me. I was curatorial blackface quite often when I was a new curator. And, one example is Columbia was trying to really get the Amiri Baraka papers. And at the time I was a Lehman curator of American history. And they would ask me to go on the donor calls to meet Amiri Baraka, and that was great. I really liked the fact that I got to meet, the great Amiri Baraka, but I was always told that we feel that he can relate better to you, and also it would show that we are about diversity, and it can help us get this collection. And I also say when you're thinking about doing DI work, it has to be fully embedded. And you have to be mindful of your spaces. So check your reading room. And I'm really proud of the work that we did here at Cornell with our Lincoln Memorial, with our bus. We have the Gettysburg Address here at Cornell, the Bancroft copy. And we've had a number of exhibits about Abraham Lincoln during that. And one of our researchers actually kind of said to us, not everybody experiences or thinks of the legacy of Abraham Lincoln in the same way that you do at Cornell. So our curatorial leadership team really got together and had a great talk about ways that we can make our reading rooms more inclusive. When you're actualizing DEI work through collections development, you have to ask what framework is necessary to facilitate inclusive collection development. And the first thing I ask to do is that you reflect and look at your past, look at your present acquisitions and approval plans, and give yourself a report card. Every library falls into a rut, I believe, when they fail to hit the reflect fresh button on our collection development plans. We tend to create them and we don't go back to them. As curators assert their authority through acquisitions of underengaged narratives and are multiplying collections, we must ensure that we're not enduring white and male-dominated historical narratives. Next, you have to ask yourself, what are the anti-racist and social justice benchmarks that you actually want to establish with the collection? Does each staff member have consistent goals and share the same intent on how to go about this work? And I'll often find that when you're dealing with groups of curators or librarians, that one librarian may be really all about the gusto, about going all DEI on collection acquisitions, but another one may think, okay, we're actually just doing this for this year, this period after George Floyd, and maybe we need to pull back and look at some of our other priorities. So it's important that everyone have a shared vision around that. When it comes to the reality of your resources, to make the changes that you need to take a long, honest look at your library's institutional culture and what they prioritize among the selectors and curatorial budgets. You have to ask for transparency and equity around the budget, and how you have to communicate to your fellow selectors how this work can be done equitably along with competing priorities. And one thing I've noticed is that you may be surprised that there's a bit of revisionist interpretations of what the budget priorities are, because not at Cornell, but I've experienced where one year we did think it was going to be African Americana, and the next year they told us, well, did we really say that? What did we really mean by that? So it's good to keep a good record of that. You have to ask who are your allies in this work and who are the resistors and skeptics, and that will kind of challenge you when you're doing this work, and the barriers that are going to hinder you from doing this. Remember, all of our libraries have entrenched power structures that are present that you will need to overcome. I also want to put forth that you have to be prepared to have sometimes difficult conversations with your development officers and your donors, particularly because I've worked with a lot of development officers. Sometimes they have an idea of what they believe funders would like to bring into your library, but you've made these new priorities around making your collections more inclusive. And so you have to communicate that value to your development officer as well as your friends of the libraries group, and get them to have buy-in with the collections that you're trying to bring in. And this also works to let them know that these collections, although they are diverse from what we may have been doing before, that look for tangible ways that they can connect with other collections that are existing. And also, does your library administration support you, or just give you what we call the black pat on the head, and that they're really authentic about supporting you when you really begin doing this work just beyond doing presentations? These are just some quick categories of ways to categorize, your rare and distinctive collections for inclusive development initiatives. You should look at which ones are your core or foundational collections. A lot of these collections fall into local history or interpretive collections with different research value levels. And also, you have to recognize and you have to own this, that sometimes you're going to have questionable curatorial authority and cultural ownership questions around your collection. So these are candidates for repatriation or restitution. The research value is usually high for indigenous cultures, and consult NACPA or other appropriate consultation. I will use as an example the Caucasia division that's within my portfolio. We are beginning to, ask ourselves questions about things that we have in our collections, and work with Amy Dougherty, who is our copyright services librarian, to develop policy around that, because you might eventually have to return these materials to the original source community. And we did at Cornell actually repatriate a diary to the Mohegan tribe. And this is from the write-up that was in the Library Journal in March of 2021. Cornell was very proud to return this to the Mohegan tribe, and we put up no resistance about it. And one of the things that we really wanted to bring home in the Library Journal piece was we wanted the Mohegan tribe to have their perspective in the story, and then the Cornell perspective. And here's a picture of me on the day that we returned the diary, and the Mohegan tribe brought us a gift, and that's me examining the gift. In the questions, a number of you asked about diversifying STEM collections, and I just wanted to talk about some of the work that is being done at Cornell through the Mann Library, which is our library for life sciences and agricultural collections. Special collections librarian Deborah Cook and user engagement and inclusion librarian Selena Bryant both brought awareness to the Modern Farmer, which is it was a paper that was for farmers of color, and it was one of the few of its kind. And a lot of the information in it was from the National Federation of Colored Farmers. And there's a quote that they believe that they should own and control their own cooperative associations. They also hosted at Mann Library a Black in STEM Wikipedia edit-a-thon that was really successful. And so, there are ways to bring STEM into these conversations. One of my priorities as AUL here, since we have such strong STEM collections and history of science collections at Cornell, was to begin embedding them more in primary source literacy. And learning how to diversify those is something that we're definitely looking forward to doing. I just wanted to say quickly, as I start to wrap up, when you're diversifying your collections, understand that this is something that cannot be done, overnight or in a month. I think it's best to have a plan strategy where it's staggered out, and so you can meet benchmarks. So if you see here, when you're thinking about these collections, understand that you're going to have to face these privilege dominated narratives that are embedded throughout your collections, but you also have to embed anti-racist frameworks throughout every level of service in your libraries and archives. So you see this goal is color coded, which is a collection development DEI goal. But then here we also have a DEI public services goal. So that may include ways that your reading room can be more inclusive as opposed to your collections. And then a DEI curatorial goal, and then an outreach goal, and then a staff development goal, because it's, to do this work, we all need to be up on our cultural competencies in order to do the best we can at it. And then you see, again, we loop around to the DEI collection development goal too. And this is staggered out over time. And that way you don't become overwhelmed, and you're able to measure your successes more, and also not taking on more than you can handle. For future outcomes, I always say I think it's best to document your efforts. A future curator will thank you. You don't know how many people have come before us that may not have documented this, or you'll look in the archives and see maybe just a folder of something they did. And I think it would be tremendously helpful. Also, assess how new approaches to diversifying narratives within your collection have changed over time, and the success of those outcomes. And celebrate and ensure that your work and the connections you made or sustained. You should celebrate this. I think everybody in library science took a lot of work on this year. And I just also wanted to highlight this poster that's from Lighthouse for the Blind. And when we think about diversity, this is a poster that shows people who are blind, but in different settings that we wouldn't think of them normally. Yes, they can learn how to use a white cane, but here is reading a map, cooking without looking. And, also, we have to put a check on ourselves about the narratives that we build about people with disabilities, that, it's not, often they are framed in the context of labor and activism, but just like everyone else, they do other things. They cook, they sing, they dance. And so think of ways that you can frame other narratives around some of your collections. And I just wanted to say thank you. That is all from me. This is me last summer in my mask. I'm glad that I'm vaccinated and I do not have to wear that anymore. So I'm signing off with that, and thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Tamar. That was very insightful. Okay, now we're going to go to Roxanne. Are you ready, Roxanne?
Yes, let me just get my screen shared here, and I'll get it going once I am ready. Okay, here we go. Thanks, Mary Beth, and thanks, Tamar, for starting us off strong. My name is Roxanne Bukowski. I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, or UWEC. And UWEC is a public liberal arts regional comprehensive university with approximately 10,000 FTE and a branch campus, UWEC Barron County. UWEC occupies the sacred and ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples. We honor the land of the Ojibwe and Dakota nations. I'd like to thank ACRL for hosting this webinar. I'd like to shout out to whoever suggested me as a panelist for this presentation. And then I'd also like to thank my colleagues and research mentors, Robin Miller and Kate Hinnant. I'm an early career librarian. I'm an early career researcher. And so I'm going to share what I've learned so far, hopefully give you some food for thought and suggestions on how to move forward. I looked back over our description for this presentation, Cultures of Collecting, and I noticed a part that said experts will discuss. And I don't feel comfortable claiming expertise in all areas of collections and diversities. Just one voice, sharing what I've learned, and I'm here to listen, learn, and continue the conversation. Here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to give you some information about the current context, and then I'm also going to talk about my own research about curricular choices, diversity initiatives, and library ebook usage at UWEC. You can read more about my research in the Charleston Voices. I co-wrote a chapter with Tim Morton in the Charleston Voices Perspectives from the 2019 conference. In addition to talking about my research, I'm going to give 3 recommendations for diversity collection assessment. They're related to my research conclusions, and I'm going to share what some strong research examples of diversity collection assessment as well. Just an FYI, I'll be using EDI as an acronym for equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And now let's move on to current context. When Mary Beth and the panelists, myself, we were planning this webinar, Mary Beth sent out an article about the Ithaca SNR research report that was recently published. That report is called The National Movements for Racial Justice and Academic Library Leadership. It shares findings from fall 2020 and surveys library directors, and the purpose of it was to examine how perspectives and strategies relevant to EDI and anti-racism have evolved over the last year. One of the key findings from this report is the majority of directors have not developed strategies to recenter their collections around authors of color and/or anti-racist content. Likewise, most librarians have not developed criteria for evaluating and making decisions related to the diversity of their collections. The research report states that about 1/3 of library directors felt their library had developed criteria for evaluating the diversity of their collections. But only 17% of library directors said that their library's strategies to recenter their collections around authors of color and anti-racist content, only 17% said that those strategies were well developed. We have room for improvement here. My research and background allows me to speak more about developing criteria for evaluating collections for diversity. And so that's what the focus of my part of the presentation will take. I'm going to give you some background about diversity initiatives at UW-Eau Claire that I factored into my research. The first one relates to EDI expectations. In 2018, a personnel measure went into effect that all reviews of employees include evaluation of a faculty or staff member's EDI engagement. Contributions can be demonstrated through teaching, curricular development, scholarly activity, engagement in initiatives that directly serve or reach out to under-engaged communities, and professional development. This Inside Higher Education article that's pictured on the screen is from May 2017, talks about when that policy went into effect. The second of 2 diversity initiatives at UW-Eau Claire that I factored into my research was in the academic year 2016-17, there is liberal education reform, and this replaced our general education program and of course updated our graduation requirements. One change was adding social responsibility to the curriculum requirements. Responsibility is one of the 4 goals in the liberal education reform, and the 2 learning outcomes underneath responsibility relate directly to EDI. Soon after these 2 diversity initiatives were implemented at UWEC, I noticed, as the head of electronic resources and acquisitions, I noticed that there is an increase in the number of EDI titles within our top 20 used ebooks over 2 different academic years. This led to a lot of questions, but I suspected there could be a link between the curriculum changes and new EDI expectations and usage of ebooks. Long story short, this led to my formal research question. Are UWEC instructors changing the required materials they assign to students as a result of the 2 campus diversity initiatives, and what is the impact on library ebook collections? I found that instructors at UWEC are responding to the campus diversity initiatives by changing their curricular materials they assign to students and incorporating more EDI content. I also found concurrent demand for library ebook content related to EDI when these initiatives were going into effect. the rate of use increased slightly from 17% to 19%. And I'll talk more about this later in my presentation, but the qualitative methods in part of my research produced more meaningful results. I had consistent findings among the different data techniques, and that would suggest that these findings are reasonably valid. I'm using triangulation here. You might be wondering at this point, how did I come to these conclusions and what are those data techniques? I used a survey to ask faculty and instructors about their curricular choices and the reading materials they assigned to students. And 1/3 of respondents said that they had adapted or developed a course due to the EDI expectations and the liberal education reform. 75% said they increased the amount of reading materials related to EDI or social responsibility in their curriculum and reading materials. The focus group was designed to go into depth about the process of identifying, selecting, and assigning course readings, and comments from instructors who participated mirrored the findings of the survey that instructors are incorporating more diverse voices into their curriculum. Lastly, I used ebook statistics as a quantitative method, and my goal with this was to determine the rate of use of EDI-related ebook titles over 3 years. I gave a yes/no determination based on titles for anything that could be used in an EDI context, 12,000 titles in total. The criteria I used was content about non-dominant cultures and identities, intercultural and interpersonal communication, social scientific literature, and professional development material. I'll note here that this quantitative methods has a limitation. Once a researcher, like myself, uses a definition or criteria, there's a level of subjectivity here. So I'm adding a disclaimer that only one person, me, a white cisgender female, was categorizing this data. I acknowledge that my privilege and biases are likely to show. That's a quick overview of my research and my conclusions. Now I'm going to move into the second part of my presentation, which is the 3 recommendations for diversity collection assessment. The first one is to evaluate your collection for diversity with context. What do I mean by with context? Our libraries don't exist in a bubble. We're part of larger institutions. It's essential that academic libraries link assessment, but especially collection assessment, to our library and/or universities' values, goals, and interests. Beyond our institutions, we are part of a larger society. We can be impacted by social movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter organizing, and events like George Floyd's murder that renew our commitment and provide a lens or framework for collection assessment. The example that I'd like to highlight with my first recommendation is from Janice Linton and Ada Dukas at the University of Manitoba, the Health Sciences Library. They used the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Canada call to action in 2015 to assess their Indigenous health sciences collection. The Indigenous health librarian worked with faculty to develop themes from the 7 calls. There are about 94 calls, I believe, and 7 of those are related to health. So they developed themes from the 7 calls and then used them as a checklist to identify subject areas that they had covered in the collection as a way to evaluate how well the specialized collection was able to support the work of faculty at their campus who are also working to respond to those calls of action. They purposely developed this framework as a model for addressing interrelated health and social inequities in other communities. I also want to point out, in their research, they participated in development of and implementation of anti-racist Indigenous health course for the medical school, utilizing the content from the Indigenous health collection and the expertise of the health sciences librarian to incorporate it throughout the course. Linton and Dukas concluded that the Indigenous health collection not only documents Indigenous health, but supports and respects Indigenous peoples. I encourage you to read the 2017 article for more information about their collection assessment for diversity project. The second recommendation I have is to involve your campus community. We should involve our campus community because as academic libraries, we have moved from collection-centric models to engagement-based models of teaching, learning, and research, and our assessment practices should reflect that. The example that I'd like to share here is from Tammy Bobrowski and Colleen Dell from Bemidji State University. They presented last month at the Minnesota Academic and Research Libraries Conference about their assessment project. And their project included creating a collection development checklist that could be applied to the entire book collection with demographic snapshots, holding reports, deep dives into those reports. And they meant for it to be reused, to be cyclical and adapted for long-term work. The tool that I would like to highlight from their collection assessment project is the faculty feedback sessions, essentially like focus groups. They met with departments after doing the deep dive into the holdings data, and they asked questions such as, what topics does your discipline discuss and or consider related to diverse and multicultural context, as well as other questions. They reflected and coded the responses and then used the feedback to purchase new materials, which is an example of how we do the assessment and then incorporate it back into our collection assessment workflows and regular work. They also talked about student perspectives and how we can bring student perspectives into evaluating our collections for diversity. I personally don't have insights here, but I would look to everyone attending today and hope that you can share examples and strategies for that moving forward. The third and final recommendation for diversity collection assessment that I have is using a mixed methods approach. I found from my project that the qualitative results produce more meaningful results. On the flip side, there are researchers out there who have used quantitative methods and found meaningful results too. I have two examples. The first one, Scott Stone, a researcher at the University of California, Irvine, studied the demographics of playwrights in the play scripts collection. Stone asks a question in the article that was published. Does a librarian have a responsibility to create a collection that reflects their local population? I thought this was interesting. Although I work at a predominantly white institution in a primarily white city and a white state, and I wondered how I could apply this collection assessment here at UWEC. UWEC has about 12% students of color, 18% faculty employees of color, and while the university has publicly stated commitment to EDI, work to implement these with campus diversity initiatives, and is striving to increase enrollment of students to color to 20%, I wonder if these aspirations are significant enough to be a measure for our collection assessment for diversity. Perhaps using the future demographics could be a minimum goal, or the stated aspirations could be a goal. I don't have the answers here. I'm looking forward to discussion about this, but I do think demographics should inform methodology, though it looks different for each institution. There's also the problem of supply. It's a related issue. The publishing industry must continue to work to diversify their materials so libraries can acquire them, and librarians need to be paying attention to the publishing landscape and responding proactively. The second example that I'd like to highlight for my third recommendation here is from Oregon State University, Laurel Christek. Christek established a bibliography from 22 diversity awards for a total of 2,400 titles and found their library had 22% of these titles. This project also used benchmarking and comparing to peer institutions, and they found that Oregon State University libraries had a significantly higher percentage of titles that cover persons with disabilities, multiculturalism, and Asian Americans, and found gaps in titles by and about Latinx and Native Americans. Christek's bibliography and model are meant to be shared. I encourage you to go to that article to find the supplementary materials. And again, these are both examples of using quantitative methods to find meaningful results that can be incorporated back into our collection development. just a quick review. So those are my 3 recommendations for diversity collection assessment. Evaluate your collection for diversity with context. Involve your campus community and use a mixed methods approach. Additionally, we should acknowledge that problems exist with our methods and continue to think critically about them. Relying too heavily on one method should be cautious if you're doing that. And we must consider if these methods have been influenced by systemic racism, inequities, and inequities that exist within our institutional structures. My final parting message to you is restart now. There is no single resource to build or maintain diverse collections, and there's no single assessment method. Recommit to this long-term ongoing work. Think about this. What do you want to pursue and what do you want to learn? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Roxanne. That was really inspiring and insightful. I do appreciate all of your insights and also your cultural humility. That was nice that you began with that. So now we can hear from Scarlett, if you can begin.
I have to say before I begin that I'm very happy to, for a really long time, I felt like I was not one of the only people talking about collections and vendor relationships and what kind of structures influence all of those things, but it's really nice to be on a panel where I am not kind of the fiery outlier about those things. So I'm very grateful that I had a chance to be on the panel with all of you today. Where is present? Okay, can everybody see my screen all right? I can't see the chat if I want you to respond. Okay.
Yes, we can see it. We can see it. No worries.
Okay. You would think after a year or more into this that I would be better at this, and I just not today, apparently. So anyhow, thanks everyone for your patience. My name is Scarlett Galvin. My talk today is Collections as Culture. And we'll get started. So that's me. I am currently the area lead for assessment and planning and collection strategist librarian at Grand Valley State University Libraries. You can find me on various platforms at Panoptigoth for all kinds of cat pictures. Grand Valley State is an M1 and a public master's comprehensive with a couple of doctorate programs and a growing emphasis on STEM at the graduate level with about 25,000 students, plus or minus whoever decides to enroll at the last minute, as our institutions often have. And most of those are undergraduates. I came into the collection strategist role in mid-2019. So this is a new role for both the university libraries here and for me. My background is in resource management and in systems. I come from systems librarianship and resource sharing and electronic resource management. And like I mentioned, I also lead assessment and planning library-wide. And so my goal today is to discuss how we've started to attempt to build more equitable collections at Grand Valley over the last 2 years and leave a lot of space for Q&A because this topic is important to so many of us. And I think we rarely make the space we might to discuss the possible when it comes to how these sorts of initiatives might work and be sustained. So I'll talk about my current approach in the context of some of the questions that were submitted before this session. And I've been adjacent to this work for a little while now, and I want to share an example of when the Information Maintainers Group, which is a Sloan-funded project, was writing Information Maintenance as a Practice of Care, which was a white paper that came out of those efforts. We had a large section on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. You will sometimes hear me use the shorthand IDEA for this, although I'm partial to JEDI because it includes justice. And the feedback we got on that was that it was a little bit checkboxy, and a number of us finally said out loud that this is just the work. This is just the work that we do. The community is part of this in treating IDEA work or EDI work as though it's separate from like, this is just a thing that you do in addition to your real job, whatever that means, actually just makes the problem worse, as Tamar and Roxanne have already suggested. So the first part, the first thing that I sort of use to articulate and do the work at Grand Valley is that the collections are the culture, just like your budget and your space and your policies too. So your collection as it exists right now is one manifestation of the library's values. So just like how your staffing levels and who gets hired to do the work, how your physical space functions, policies, rules, notices, and communications, all of that is your culture. And as organizations, I think that libraries spend a great deal of time on mission, vision, and value statements, and they certainly have a utility in that they're aspirational and identify gaps between what's actually happening and how we'd like it to be. So it's not surprising that our collections are white, because higher education is pretty white. Scholarly communication systems that we're embedded in are incredibly white. And our ideas about professionalism and who's allowed to take up space in librarianship, also super white, are all influenced by this too. Which means that budget decisions are value decisions too, just like the collection and the space and the policies. So when we choose to pay unsustainable increases or continue to support models for purchasing that create problems for us, we're inevitably not buying something else. Because when we buy something, we're not buying something else sometimes. I saw several questions about, for this webinar, about how to balance competing needs of academic libraries, and I'd like to address that a little bit, because when our institutions talk about pressures and everything else that we're required to do, and how do we make the collection inclusive in light of all this, it's almost like, and I'm sure this isn't the intention, but that we're asking for a reason to avoid the work, because a thoughtful collection can't wait on a stable budget because we've never had one. We can wait for strategic moments for advocacy, but those are rarely perfect moments. So where did we start at GVSU? We're looking at what are our values. We had to rewrite our collection development policy, look at how to evaluate resources in the first place, looking at demand-driven acquisitions and PDA programs, because those can introduce significant bias as well. Look at deal breakers and vendor expectations, and then mapping licensing terms to our values. And I'll get to why that's important for equity and justice-oriented initiatives shortly. So when we talk about guiding principles in collection development here, we want them to be sustainable, responsive, and collective. And by sustainable, we mean that we champion the success of every student through investigating, promoting, and publishing in open and alternative models of scholarly communication, and that we promote the dissemination and impact of our work through the institutional repository, through open educational resources, and similar kinds of initiatives. And we recognize that sustainability comes from open scholarship as well as open infrastructure. So some of you won't be surprised to hear that we're migrating to Folio soon as part of that principle and kind of guiding and orienting purpose. And that we're also responsive. And so we have so many data points to understand the evolving interests, priorities, and experiences of our patrons, and we develop the library's collection through automated processes and human intervention, and we select resources and develop services focusing on flexible access that are responsive to curricular needs. And then finally, I wanted to make sure that we had a collective approach, and so that we use the incredible group of people who work here and all of their expertise to connect the community with more resources than it would be possible to obtain through traditional acquisitions methods and limited budgets. So leveraging those communities, leveraging those local resources to see how we can be active collaborators in those networks and make sure that those support student learning, because we recognize that the future is shared. If the last year has taught people anything, it's that going alone is not a great plan. And so we might do better kind of working together and moving together. So the first big task that I had was rewriting the collection development policy. The previous one was from 2012. It was fine for 2012, but I needed something that communicated the work of collection development to internal and external audiences, so it became human readable and more reflective of actual practice in order to normalize this is a living document. it's something we need to examine and update because it's a tool. You can't do good work with tools that aren't serving you. In particular, I want to point out this section that was reviewed by library faculty here and then teaching faculty as part of our governance process. And it's a statement that acknowledges and reads power within the collection, and says variety of power dynamics exist in academic libraries between patrons, content providers, supply chains, technologies and systems, disciplinary canon, accreditation, metrics and assessment, and the institutions we serve. This is ultimately reflected in what and how and why the library manages and develops the greater collection, because it's not static. It's living and influenced by many individuals, strategic priorities, and various stakeholders. And so university libraries collects and maintains in a deliberate, sustainable, and purpose-driven way to support our communities. We recognize that none of the metrics, benchmarks, or tools that we use to evaluate, arrange, or describe the collection are free from bias. And so university libraries, faculty, and staff work on individual and systemic levels to address those biases, because I didn't want to have a collection development policy that didn't acknowledge that didn't acknowledge how power works within the document. And so we look at something like, how do you get buy-in for this? How do you evaluate resources for this? So the first three criteria that are here, ease, breadth, and uniqueness, are from Karen Harker, Laurel Crawford, and Todd Enach's presentation to Charleston a few years ago at this time. And I'll send that link out when I'm done here. The last column is, kind of for us to explore and define, recognizing that what idea looks like for a particular resource might be very different between, one database or one book or one particular curriculum map, or however these, kind of work. This also was important for me to co-create this last value with our liaison team, because without buy-in, this just doesn't work. And I also recognize that equity and inclusion isn't just one category. Like the collection development policy, this should be something that helps us, not create more restrictions. And the same thing happens around acquisitions questions, as though if we buy enough of a particular author or authors, suddenly we'll have an anti-racist collection, and that's not how it works at all. It's also really important, was really important for me as someone really new to the institution, to be able to kind of focus liaison subject expertise into something that they looked at, understood, and wanted to be part of. And also, I want to say that demand-driven acquisition is nice because it automates much of the approval plan, and it's awful because it automates a lot of an approval plan, which, depending on underlying systems and criteria, might be undoing all of the work you're trying to do. So if you've got an approval plan like the development policy, it needs analysis and looking into outcomes and what are we actually buying and what did we miss. And there have been some, but not a lot yet, articles and research that say that librarians are still beating approval plans in terms of building well-rounded collections. So again, making sure that our automated systems are interrogated by people. And I want to get into where we might get the money to do all these kinds of things. And it's the same place we get the money for anything else. It's a question of deciding that equity is a priority for the library, right? So since coming to GVSU, I've been working on a more flexible and visual way to explain the mapping process between here's what an actual clause looks like in a license agreement, and here's the value that it maps to and why it's important. So I've been using this to communicate these ideas in a different arrangement, and it's also how we're able to develop and articulate the conditions in, say, a vendor contract, and able to situate our relationship so that we understand when a relationship is working for us with the content provider and when it's not anymore, and the conditions under which we'll walk away. It's trying to answer the question of what do our values actually look like on the ground? And I've been lucky to build a strong negotiating team. And it's important because I'm asked again, how do we fund this when we need to fund everything else? And this is how we fund it. It's by using this particular moment to refuse business as usual and to devote the time necessary to correct our collections and include more voices. This is the amount of money I have saved 3 different institutions by being allowed to negotiate, and I've been able to free up so much more in terms of where we might direct funds and what we could buy, and really been able to completely break open what is possible. Again, because the structure here allows me to do that. It's okay, it's a number, I'm gonna beat that number next year. And as far as, you know, kind of how do we embed this in different disciplines? This is from Sensoy and D'Angelo writing about job interviews in higher education in 2017. We are advocating for an understanding that one cannot be considered to have subject matter expertise if you can't position your field within a socio-political context. And so making sure too that when we hire, when we talk about our disciplines, especially in the context of being in the classroom, when we talk about pedagogy and how we search and how we advocate for students, where we're able to situate those kinds of goals. And just really briefly, I want to talk about what some next steps here are. We need more in-depth curricular mapping. We have a little bit, but really having a high-level view of what's happening and how to make it work. I've set aside a certain amount of money for microgrants for teaching faculty to really be able to get in more authors and different collections, and also just making decisions every day, like, do we really need this many books by Henry Kissinger, or perhaps someone else has written things about foreign policy and foreign affairs in the United States? Like, just saying, maybe I don't need to replace that. Movement through shared governance. So at GVSU, we librarians have faculty status and also run through the same tenure and promotion process. So that means that I'm in certain rooms that I might not otherwise have access to if I did not have that status. So making sure that we're building equity there and including our partners in the teaching faculty environment into how all of this works. Strategic work in faculty tenure and promotion processes, and really looking at those documents to see who talks about educational resources, who defines a textbook in their promotion and tenure processes, and how might we maybe get OER into some of those, how might we get open access into some of those too, evaluation and assessment of all these things, because even if none of this works, I at least have to know why it didn't work and what I might do next. And then as my co-presenters have suggested, really just deeper engagement with students, because we all know what happens. I've been on both sides of this, right? I've been the person who is engaging with a particular group of students, and then I've left an institution, and I've also watched that happen where someone is kind of the only connection. And so making sure that it's not just one person who's reaching out to say Laker Familia or any number of other student groups, so that the library is more than one person to our students, and making sure that that happens. Stop share. All right, now that I can actually see the chat, I will close out, but thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Scarlett. Yeah, the chat was very active. I think it was that a lot of people were really sort of saving up their engagement until you started to talk, as you were sort of firing on all cylinders, and then it made everybody sort of just talk about all these things. So there was a whole lot of good things going on. One of the things that was primary, at least at the very beginning of the conversation, seemed to be about how the failure of Gobi from many institutions who devote most of their collection development money by purchasing through Gobi, and how difficult it is to be able to find things, perhaps because they aren't either tagged appropriately or just they're not there. And many of the libraries are a little hamstrung in not being able to sort of break out some funds from that sort of place where it's locked in order to be able to purchase through local BIPOC bookstores or even just through Amazon. So I didn't know if you have any suggestions for that.
A little bit. I know that one of the things that we have just launched through our diversity, equity, and accessibility committee here is the idea of investigating the supply chains within the library itself, and what would happen if we diverted a certain amount of money from Amazon, or made it, the third option or the fourth option instead of the second option after Gobi or something, because we have similar, kinds of lock-in issues. And, what would it look like if we invested that money locally in Michigan, potentially a Black-owned bookstore, or, because there are several here, and just what would happen if we took that money and invested it back into the community, instead of, just kind of giving it over to Amazon. There can only be so much divestment, right? Because so much of the infrastructure and internet is based in, Amazon Web Services, but we can certainly not, purchase physical items, from them. So, but I do have concerns about Gobi lock-in, and it's something we should start leaning on and discussing more.
That's excellent. Thank you. So I'm seeing another question here. It seems like a lot of efforts around transformation are happening in direct consultation and engagement with the campus faculty. What an awesome approach. And any tips on how to encourage engagement when folks are feeling really burned out and unable to take on more? And that's for any of the panelists to respond to, really.
I can share a couple things. I think, burnout is a common experience right now. And I think, I do think giving people a breather is a good thing. Engaging in faculty, whether through it's a survey and volunteering, or Bemidji State University has it in their collection development plan, I believe, to meet with each department every 3 years. And I think if you're doing the deep dive and looking at our collections and coming from it with an authentic place, I think faculty would be open to that, and I think they would enjoy being asked about engaging in the collections and discussions about it. So I'm very much a person that I always say I can learn from others. And I would love to go straight to all the faculty at my campus and say, what could we be doing better? And they're getting to the question. I think some of the questions that came in beforehand were about certain disciplines, and I'm also the person to say, I'm not a subject expert, and so I would leave that to others. And I think it would show good collaboration if the library is reaching out for faculty insights. I don't think this is new work. I think it's just a recommitment to this work, and that incorporating faculty or student perspectives is something that we can do. We just have to remind ourselves how to do it.
At Cornell, we have a faculty library board, which is very supportive of all the librarians. And one of the things I do is I always try to have meetings with them and all of our curators. So at Cornell, we have about, I think it's probably 17 curators, 5 in the rare and manuscript collections division. And then I have 5 in my Asia division and Africana curator, and just get them to more accustomed to the work that we're doing. I've also been reaching out to faculty to be involved in those grants that they're writing, because so often they'll write grants about library collections, but a librarian is not on the, the panel or part of the planning. So I'm now part of the Cornell Belonging Telling Our Stories grant. And I had to kind of hit the ground running, doing, a lot of that work with them, but I can say this is one of the best places where I've had really good faculty involvement and just teaching them what we do. You know, often faculty will say, why do curators buy what they buy? And I'm actually considering having a advisory board just for the curators so that they can see the acquisitions we're thinking about and how they can embed that in their curriculum. And I know, you know, a lot of this is different from circulating collections, and you know, my portfolio is kind of a hybrid. You know, I have distinctive and rare collections, so I have to strike that balance with all of them. But they've been very open to working with us, and you know, Roxanne, I was thinking of you. I have to make concentrated effort to go to those department meetings, like for the East Asia faculty. And yeah, I do think, but at least here it's been rewarding because I've worked at universities where it's not been. You know, you'll reach out to a faculty member and you'll never get an email back about anything, but it's been really positive here at Cornell.
Thank you for that. That's great. Okay, there was a question earlier about ways that we can try to engage with the students to be able to get their perspectives on collection development. Does anybody have any good solutions for that?
I saw someone in chat mention own voices, and I know about other projects where they've been centered on a class where there's been collection development on, say, graphic novels, or go find, you know, a series of books that have been, you know, that are within this topic or something like that. And then there's a dedicated program that then buys those. And then as that course is taught over time, those then become part of the collection, and there's a pretty substantial I know I'm using graphic novels as an example because I know that several libraries have faculty that have built graphic novel collections that way, specifically on, say, immigration or you know, whatever, you know, the topic happens to be. The other thing that I, for some reason, forgot to mention is that one of the things that I think is really critical, especially as we start diverting funds kind of toward primary sources at institutions like Grand Valley and newspaper sources, or, you know, whatever those happen to be, or streaming, or whatever it is that we're looking into, making sure that we collect the everyday and that we collect joy. It is really, really easy for EDI and idea-based efforts to, you know, when whatever History Month comes around, for it to be a wall that is just a bummer. And for you to just kind of walk in and be, and I don't mean to say that to make light of any of that, because obviously it's important history and it's meaningful, and but just, there has to be more than that. And so one of the things I said in a meeting is that, yeah, we need to collect Black joy just as much as we collect any, you know, everything else. Is that I want to buy stuff that Issa Rae is doing, and, you know, I want to buy Pose, and I want to, just as much as I need to buy another copy of Band Played On. Like there's a lot happening there. And that also, if we want to you know, buy more items from independent publishers and things like that, that's going to be more cataloging labor, right? Because some of that's going to be more individual cataloging. And so really getting into that, yes, thank you. Trauma porn resources is a very good example of it. It's like, it's not, that story is exhausting, and it is not all of the experience of what it means.
Right.
And I just, making sure that that's part of the conversation as well too.
It's kind of like those overplayed narratives, you know, all Black history is not slavery, you know, and civil rights, and you're right, stories of Black triumph, Black joy, but also in reaching with the students, even though I'm in special collections, I've been in special collections my entire library career, I do believe we need to break down silos between special collections and the liaisons, the subject liaisons and selectors, because, you know, we're all doing this work together. And I think it would be really neat to have student curated exhibits that involve both curators and selectors, and show that there's a research life cycle in the library, and it just doesn't only revolve around special collections. And so, yeah, that's one approach to it I think I have.
Okay, before we get too much further along here, we've got about 15 more minutes. I just wanted to call out Sandra Riggs, who had put some information in the chat about the fact that at UGA, they're attempting to organize a community of practice group for assessment of diverse collections. Sandra, if you're still on, if you want to throw your email address into the chat again so people can be aware of that, and then they can reach out to you if there's interested in joining in that effort. There was also a lot of information about earlier about other groups that seem to want to sort of join together to be able to move forward. It's like we've sort of found our community here. There was a question in the chat about finding alternative places beyond Gobi where you can find inclusive book collections. Is there a single location where one can get that, or do you really have to sort of do the research in your area locally?
I'm a little uncertain in my answer here, but I would say start with your independent and local bookstores. I'm not sure if you have to look farther than that, because I'm guessing they have a fair amount of expertise, and depending on what you find out from them, you know, if they can get book titles that are not available in Gobi, and you can set up purchasing from them, that seems like a clear path forward for me.
So sorry, I'm trying to keep up with chat. You guys are all very active here. Okay, this is an interesting one. What are some of the ways in which academic libraries can collaborate with their public libraries in their area and region for collection development?
I'll take it only because I worked at Columbia Library and New York Public at the same time. I mean, one of the ways they collaborate is through the recap facility that is a storage facility where, you know, they all send collections in a cooperative storage, but through collection development, they do work together on those, even though I wasn't directly involved in it because, again, I'm special collections. I think, you know, here in Ithaca, you know, Cornell is obviously a very big system. Actually, Ithaca Public Library, from what I understand, was here before Cornell and Ezra Cornell was actually, you know, one of the either founders or trustees of Ithaca Tompkins County Public Library, actually. And, you know, I would like to do more with them. Especially, I love working with K through 12. You don't often see it with primary source literacy, but I always kind of would go out of my way and volunteer to bring rare books into schools, you know, with K through 12 students. And that's a way I really would like to see the hook in that between academic and public libraries.
I can share one idea. The UW University of Wisconsin system is moving forward with academic within our system to subscription to Overdrive, and so while the collections will be separate, the public libraries in the state already have that collection, and as we're just starting that collection, I'm very much thinking of how we can incorporate under engaged voices, and especially since okay, too much information. I'm hoping that we can engage somehow, you know, learn from the public library's experience, because I'm guessing they've worked with Overdrive, and the same experience that we've had with Gobi of things not being available or trying to promote resources and voices that we want to instead of Overdrive and the publishers pushing that. I suspect that there's some overlap there.
All righty. I think I'm going to throw this one to Roxanne because I believe you sort of touched on this in your presentation. Do you have recommendations for beginning the process of assessing current collections for diversity? We're just starting to have these conversations at my institution, and one of the questions that's come up is how do how to do that assessment in an authentic way, and how and whether to look at author demographics as well as subject areas.
I think a lot of what, from the value-based perspective that Scarlett and Tamar talked about, there's a lot that goes into, for me, it was designing the study, but thinking about how you want to do collection assessment for diversity. The reason I suggested assessing your collections with context is because each of our institutions are in different contexts. Like I said, UW-Eau Claire, I'm not convinced that population or demographics is a good goal or a benchmark for us. So we had to look for something different. And that's when we were looking at changes in the curriculum and what instructors were responding to. And I gave the example of the University of Manitoba using something, actually, I mean, not just within university systems, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to actions. So, without knowing a specific library's circumstances, it's hard for me to say where to start, but it's definitely difficult to start because the question is large, and it's like, what makes sense for us? But look at those, national movements, social events. Maybe that's, you can engage faculty right away and say, what have you noticed about the library collection? Yeah, I mean, don't let getting started stop you. Though I did my research project and I learned, okay, talking to faculty definitely helped, and sorting through 12,000 ebook titles was not really helpful at all. So there are methods out there that produce, meaningful results to move forward on, but can I say that you're gonna get meaningful results right away? I'm not sure, but it's a learning process, and I think we have to commit to doing the work.
Excellent, thank you. That's so true. I think that the other thing that I'm learning more and more is that all DEI efforts are local. You can get a lot of information and learn a lot about what others are doing, but really how you sort of implement it in your own space is going to be just unique to you and your area. So the other thing that I wanted to call out is that in the chat, lots of people are putting links to different ways that the folks can find some diverse authors. And I don't think the chat is going to be saved when we actually send out the recording. So I will gather all of this to be able to get it to you in some way so that you can all be aware. There's lots of hints and tips and tricks that are going forward. I am looking for more questions. I'm not seeing any more questions. Any last questions before we have about 8 minutes here? Oh, here's one. Have any libraries connected with bookshop.org for collection purchases and supporting independent bookstores? They curate some nice lists, for instance, one current for Haitian Heritage Month. I am not aware of that group. Anyone else? So that's another call out. We'll make sure that we get you those resources as well. Oh, here's one. Okay. Thoughts, tips about successfully engaging faculty about things like cutting Lexis, Uni, Westlaw, or other. I'm sorry, it's cut off a little bit here. Other vendors with unethical data practices when those vendors seem to have the market cornered. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
So I think the concern when you bring something like getting rid of Westlaw or LexisNexis or any other Thomson Reuters product is, or any kind of giant, sort of relics thing, is that the response will be, well, our students won't know how to use it when they go out onto the job market. That is 1,000,000,000% a research skills and familiarity and comfort and confidence level with just working with that kind of data that that we can solve. And I think it will take more universities, probably ones with law schools. Whenever I see that someone has moved away from Westlaw or LexisNexis, the first thing I look is, do they have a law program? And if the answer is no, or they don't have a strong journalism program, is the other one that will get, especially LexisNexis. And that will be to just say, well, was there really a lot to lose here from a disciplinary perspective? And I always appreciate when people do that for the ethical reasons that are being cited in chat. But I want to see a law school drop it. Because that's what it's embedded in there to do, right? It's to create more consumers of Westlaw and LexisNexis and associated Thomson Reuters products. That's what it's doing. I'm not here to build consumers, which makes other people in higher ed uncomfortable. I'm here to build people who are engaged in their communities. And if that means learning how to search differently, being comfortable and learning how to evaluate user interfaces and those kinds of skills that will work, then that's how I'm going to get at that problem. So there's a lot. And I think increasingly, Thomson Reuters is going to, I guess there was a lawsuit about it, and you're seeing several law student groups on campuses come out and say, we don't want to be part of this anymore. Those kinds of things. So really kind of bringing attention to that as well. On our campus, we've done kind of work that's adjacent to that by saying, so remote proctoring is terrible. Here's just thought you should know. Here's all the reasons why we're going to sign off on it. That kind of stuff. So really making sure that the library, whenever possible, has a voice in dissenting around those things. So it will be difficult, but that's part of our relationship with those vendors, and making sure that they don't have that data capture anymore. Because what am I supposed to say to the undocumented student groups? We just sent this amount of money, to a company that is actively pursuing potentially people on my campus, and I ethically have a real problem with that. So how does that work in governance? And I think it's conversations that I'm ethically obligated to have.
That's excellent. Thank you for that perspective. Okay, this may be the last question of the day. It's 4:27, and I think it's one that all three of you might want to have a chance to answer. So the question is, what ideas do the panelists have around directing more positive practices for liaisons around EDI and rallying those who are reluctant or not willing to get involved? Because clearly all of us here, you're preaching to the choir.
One of the things I've been struggling with is, for instance, at Cornell, there are only 4 Black librarians. And, when everything first happened around George Floyd, we were doing a lot of work, on behalf of, being asked to give webinars, not just externally from Cornell, but within Cornell. And, I finally just have to say, this is the work of everyone. And, I was one of the people who I was kind of openly, against a particular position that was at a university that was an AUL for anti-racism, because, and I know Mary Beth, you're a dean, anyone who's an AUL or dean or, assistant dean, we all should be incorporating this work into our portfolios. And so I have mixed feelings about some of these new positions coming out around that, because it gives the idea that it may be that person's job and only that person's job to do that work in the library. And so I don't know if it's really resistance, but it could be apathy, at times, and just sort of passing the buck. And sometimes when I'm asked to do a presentation, I'm just like, no. But, I can help give you, the information that you need to do it to talk about your work with that. This work is not just for the people of color that are at your libraries. We're all in this together, and it's not going to work otherwise.
Okay. Any comments from either of the other 2 presenters? And it's fine if you don't have one. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Erin, I don't know if I need to toss it back to you for a final closeout.
No, but I'm happy to give one, and let me reiterate Mary Beth's thanks. That was fantastic. I took a lot of notes as well. And I also saved down the chat. So I'll pass that along to you, Mary Beth.
That's great. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
All right, then I guess we'll end. It's a 4:30 on the nose. So we really appreciate all of your kind attention and your interest in this, and look forward to more conversation around this as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.